Think about this for a moment. You're standing in a quiet Balkan village just after sunrise, but then a low rumble rolls across the valley. One of those sounds that tightens your chest before your mind understands why. In the Balkans during the Second World War, that sound was a warning. It meant the war had arrived. If you were watching Belgrade on the 6th of April, 1941, you would see the sky darken as hundreds of German aircraft swept in, dropping bombs until the city vanished beneath fire and dust. And if you were in Montenegro 3 years later, you would feel the same fear passing from home to home as occupation grew harsher and whispers of punishment spread. When Velika was attacked, when hundreds of women, children, and elderly villagers were killed in under 2 hours, you would have understood that the war no longer cared about battlefields. It claimed whoever stood in its path. But here's the part many people never hear. The men who carried out that massacre didn't simply disappear. Some faced judges, others faced something far more final. Today, you and I will follow that entire path from the first bombs over Belgrade to the last executions in a quiet Slovenian forest. The story begins in a region already tense long before the bombs fell. The Balkans had spent decades caught between rival powers, shifting borders, and political ambitions that rarely matched the wishes of the people living there. By the early 1942, Europe was already burning, and the German war machine had moved from one conquest to the next with alarming speed. Leaders across the region watched these developments with growing unease, knowing that once the bigger nations settled their disputes, the smaller ones would be forced to choose sides or be swallowed whole. Yugoslavia struggled to stay neutral, but neutrality had become almost impossible. Germany wanted a safe route toward Greece. Italy wanted to prove it could conquer the Balkans without help, and Britain tried to maintain a foothold on the continent. Surrounded by these competing interests, the Yugoslav government signed the tripartite pact with the Axis in late March, hoping to avoid invasion. The decision, however, created deep anger among many citizens, especially in Serbia and Montenegro, where distrust of German intentions ran high. Demonstrations broke out, and the government's authority quickly weakened. When news reached Berlin that Yugoslavia might withdraw its support, Adolf Hitler reacted with a sense of betrayal. He believed political uncertainty in the Balkans threatened Germany's plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union. He ordered his generals to prepare an immediate military response. Within days, aircraft were loaded, routes were drawn on maps, and troops began moving toward Yugoslav borders. The region felt a shift in the air, an unspoken understanding that something irreversible was approaching. On the 6th of April, 1941, the first wave of German bombers crossed into Yugoslav airspace. Civilians who stepped outside that morning looked up to a sky filled with engine noise. The formation of planes stretched so far that sunlight had to fight to break through. When the bombs began falling over Belgrade, entire neighborhoods disappeared in seconds, streets filled with dust, fire, and running civilians who had no idea where safety could be found. Government buildings, bridges, and rail lines were struck repeatedly. Yugoslavia had hoped to avoid war, but the war had come anyway. The ground invasion followed almost immediately. German forces attacked from multiple directions, supported by Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian units. The Yugoslav army struggled to respond, not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because they lacked time, coordination, and enough equipment to form a solid defense. As towns fell, refugees moved in long columns along mountain roads, carrying what they could. Stories spread of German troops advancing too quickly to be stopped. Within 11 days, the Yugoslav army surrendered, and the country was carved into occupation zones controlled by the Axis powers. Montenegro fell first under Italian control. Life there changed rapidly. Military patrols appeared in markets, curfews were introduced, and local leaders were pushed aside. Many villagers tried to continue their daily routines, but each week brought new restrictions. When Italy surrendered to the Allies in 1943, German forces stepped in almost instantly. They occupied the region with a determination fueled by frustration over their allies' collapse. For many locals, the situation went from difficult to unbearable. Resistance movements began forming throughout the mountains, some fighters aligned with the communist-led partisans, others with royalist groups, and their rivalries often created new tensions within the population. Despite these differences, one belief united most of them: foreign occupation had to end. Their attacks on German positions grew bolder, and each German casualty increased the occupiers' sense of vulnerability. In response, commanders began relying on harsh measures designed to break civilian support for resistance groups. Villages were searched, young men were detained, and supplies were seized. By mid-1944, Germany's grip on the Balkans was weakening. Soviet troops advanced from the east, Allied bombers caused chaos across transport routes, and partisan units gained strength. The Germans sought to hold on to key valleys, roads, and river crossings. Along the Lim River, in northeastern Montenegro, partisan forces established a strong presence. They knew the terrain, moved quickly through forests and ravines, and proved difficult to dislodge. To counter this threat, the Germans launched Operation Draufgänger, meaning daredevil. It was planned as a decisive strike to crush the partisans near the town of Andrijevica. German units were joined by elements of the 21st Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Skanderbeg, composed largely of ethnic Albanians and supported by local auxiliary groups. Together, they moved along remote paths, burning villages and clearing territory they believed sheltered resistance fighters. For many civilians, there was no chance to flee. Homes were set on fire, and entire families scattered through forests to avoid capture. Although the operation caused destruction across several communities, it failed in its main objective. The partisans survived the assault, regrouped, and then counterattacked, forcing the German and auxiliary forces into retreat. This outcome angered the commanders involved, who believed local villagers had supported the partisans more than they admitted. As the troops pulled back, frustration grew into a desire to punish anyone for the failure. When Operation Draufgänger failed to crush the partisans along the Lim River, the German command viewed it as more than a military setback. To them, it was an insult, a sign that local resistance groups had grown too confident and that villagers across the region no longer feared German authority. Anger spread quickly through the ranks, especially among units already known for brutality. Soldiers returned to their camps bitter, exhausted, and convinced that someone needed to pay for the embarrassment they had suffered. The 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prinz Eugen, was one of the main forces operating in the area. Formed in 1941, this division had earned a reputation for harsh anti-partisan tactics. Many of its men were ethnic German volunteers from Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Romania. Their loyalty to the Reich was strong, and their resentment towards Slavic populations ran deep. Over the years, they had left behind a trail of burned villages and frightened survivors in Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia. Now, they were moving through Montenegro with a renewed sense of purpose. They were not alone. The 21st Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Skanderbeg, created in Kosovo and composed mostly of ethnic Albanians, joined the operation as well. While the Prinz Eugen Division had experience, the Skanderbeg Division struggled with discipline, training, and morale. Many of its soldiers were motivated by local rivalries rather than German goals. Reports from German officers often criticized the division for looting, poor organization, and a tendency to act unpredictably in stressful situations. Yet the Germans still relied on them, believing their presence would strengthen control over Albanian and Montenegrin border areas. As these groups pushed through northeastern Montenegro, tension rose between locals and occupying forces. Villagers felt caught between all sides, partisans demanding food and shelter, Germans demanding obedience, and auxiliary groups demanding loyalty. Every rumor of partisan activity could bring a patrol searching the village. By midsummer of 1944, the atmosphere in the region had become heavy with fear. People worked their fields quietly, avoided strangers on mountain roads, and tried to predict where the next clash might occur. The small town of Andrijevica became a focal point of conflict. Its position near key mountain passes made it valuable to both the Germans and the Partisans. As battles intensified, surrounding villages suffered as well. Homes burned, crops were destroyed, and livestock vanished in ways that made survival difficult. The Partisans, despite their growing strength, could not protect every community. German units moved from house to house, searching for evidence, often punishing civilians for simply living near suspected partisan routes. During the final days of Operation Draufgänger, German frustrations reached a breaking point. The Partisans had successfully held their ground, using the forest and rugged terrain to their advantage. They slipped between ravines, set ambushes along narrow trails, and escaped through paths too steep for German vehicles. When the fighting finally ended, German commanders issued reports claiming the operation had been successful, but the tone of those reports revealed something else. August Schmidhuber, the commander of the Skanderbeg division, wrote proudly of engaging what he believed were strong enemy forces. He praised his troops and presented the operation as a solid achievement, but his description did not match the reality on the ground. In private, German officers complained about mass desertions among the Skanderbeg soldiers and criticized their involvement in civilian abuses that had brought more trouble than strategic value. Every failure, however, was assigned to the environment, the civilians, or the resistance fighters, never to the German plan itself. As the divisions moved back toward their positions, they passed by villages that had not directly been involved in the fighting, but in the minds of the angry soldiers, every village was a potential enemy. Every household a possible supporter of the Partisans. The Germans believed the civilians in the region had helped hide fighters who later attacked German units. Even without proof, this suspicion was enough to justify retribution. It was a pattern seen many times before. When an operation failed, the blame fell on the people who lived closest to the battlefield. Velika, a peaceful mountain village near Andrijevica, soon appeared on their list. It was not a large settlement. Families lived in modest stone houses, tended orchards, and raised livestock. Many of its residents were elderly or children, as younger men often worked away from the village or had already joined one of the resistance movements. Life there followed a quiet rhythm, shaped by seasons rather than politics. People knew of the fighting nearby, but many believed their distance from major roads might spare them. They had no way of knowing that German and auxiliary units viewed them differently. To the retreating soldiers, Velika represented a symbol of local defiance. It sat near a partisan-controlled area, making it easy for commanders to assume that villagers had offered shelter or information to resistance groups. No official investigation was conducted. No evidence was gathered. The decision was based entirely on resentment, fear of losing control, and a desire to send a message. The officers who planned the reprisal knew the impact such violence could have on surrounding communities. They knew that targeting a village with overwhelming force would intimidate anyone considering cooperation with the Partisans. They also believed such brutality would restore some of the authority lost during the failed operation. For the civilians of Velika, however, this decision meant something unimaginable was approaching. By late July, the movement of German and auxiliary troops through nearby valleys had become more frequent. Villagers noticed patrols on distant ridges, saw smoke rising from other communities, and heard stories from refugees arriving on foot. People felt danger drawing closer, even if no one could say exactly when it would strike. That uncertainty created a tension that hung over every home. As the sun set on the evening before the attack, the village looked calm from the outside. The soldiers who would carry out the massacre were still on the move, fueled by anger and determined to impose punishment. The morning of the attack arrived quietly, almost peacefully. In Velika, the sun rose over the slopes the same way it always had, casting long shadows across fields and small stone houses. Children woke early. Older villagers stepped outside to begin their chores, and families prepared simple breakfasts. Nothing in the first moments of that day suggested that it would end in tragedy. Yet beneath the calm, a faint sense of unease lingered. Stories from nearby villages, smoke seen in the distance, and the heavy silence that often comes before violence. As the light grew stronger, movement appeared on the ridges above Velika. At first, it was only shapes men positioned far apart, following paths that curved around the village. Soon, the villagers realized what was happening. The entire community was being surrounded. German units and auxiliary forces from the Skanderbeg division moved quietly, taking up positions with practiced coordination. The encirclement itself revealed the intention. Once the perimeter closed, the attack began. Soldiers advanced house by house, moving with deliberate speed. Many villagers were still inside their homes when they heard footsteps approaching, followed by the thud of boots against doors. Some tried to flee toward the woods, but gunfire cut through the fields, forcing people back toward the burning center of the village. Others hid in basements or behind stone walls, hoping the attackers would pass them by. But the soldiers were not looking for fighters. They were looking for victims. Flames spread quickly. Soldiers threw burning materials into homes, set roofs alight, and pushed residents back inside. Smoke rose through every street, and the sky darkened as the fire grew. Within minutes, the village was covered in a thick haze that made it hard to breathe. People ran through the smoke disoriented, trying to reach family members or find a safe path out. The attackers used this confusion to hunt down anyone who stepped into the open. The cruelty that followed was beyond anything the villagers could have imagined. Elderly men and women were struck down as they tried to escape the flames. Children were dragged from hiding places, sometimes taken from their mothers' arms. Families were separated in seconds, and many victims never knew what happened to their loved ones. The attackers moved with disturbing confidence, as if they had performed this kind of violence many times before. Eyewitness accounts collected after the war described scenes that remained burned into the memories of survivors. One woman recalled seeing a child playing outside moments before soldiers arrived. In the chaos that followed, the child was seized by several attackers in an act of shocking brutality. She tried to intervene, but fear and gunfire forced her back. She later learned that the boy's mother was killed trying to protect him. These memories, shared years later, still trembled with pain. Another survivor described losing her mother, brothers, and sister in a matter of minutes. She remembered watching her home burn, feeling powerless to stop anything. The heat, the smoke, and the screams merged into one overwhelming sound that never left her mind. After the war, she tried to explain how many people the soldiers killed that day, but numbers could not fully express the loss she had witnessed. The violence continued without pause for nearly 2 hours. During that time, more than 400 civilians were murdered. Women, children, and the elderly for the most part. Entire families disappeared in a single morning. Houses that had stood for generations collapsed into piles of ash and charred beams. Livestock wandered through the smoke, confused and terrified, while the attackers moved on to the next home. By the time the shooting slowed, Velika was unrecognizable. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the crackling sound of burning wood. They stepped into a landscape of ruin, searching for familiar faces among the devastation. Some found loved ones. Many did not. For families who survived, the silence that followed the attack was almost as painful as the violence itself. Despite the scale of the massacre, German reports written afterward described the operation as successful. Commanders praised the troops for their actions, noting that the attack had prevented partisans from launching future operations. The report's tone was cold, detached, and proud, completely disconnected from the suffering in Velika. To the occupiers, the killing of hundreds of civilians was simply part of military strategy, yet the truth could not be erased. Villagers who survived told their stories to anyone who would listen. They remembered the faces of the attackers, the insignia on their uniforms, the sound of foreign voices mixed with orders shouted in German. They remembered how the attackers moved with certainty, knowing no one would stop them. They remembered how quickly everything they loved disappeared. The word of the massacre spread across Montenegro and the surrounding regions. The tragedy of Velika became a symbol of German cruelty in the Balkans, a reminder of the violence inflicted on civilians who simply wanted to survive the war. And while the attackers left the village believing they had restored fear, they had instead created a new resolve among the people of the region. The massacre marked a turning point. It exposed the desperation of German forces as they lost control of the Balkans. It revealed the willingness of certain auxiliary units to participate in atrocities, and it set the stage for the eventual collapse of the divisions responsible. In the months after the massacre in Velika, the units responsible began to unravel. The Germans still held parts of Montenegro, Kosovo, and northern Albania, but their control weakened with each passing week. The war had turned against them, and pressure came from every direction: Soviet forces advancing from the east, Allied bombers striking supply lines, and partisan groups growing stronger in the mountains. German command tried to hold the region together, yet the ground beneath them was shifting too quickly. Formed only the year before, the division had never reached full strength. Many of its soldiers were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and motivated more by local rivalries than by German military goals. Desertions were frequent. At times, entire groups of men abandoned their posts to return home or join other armed groups. German officers wrote frequent reports complaining about the division's reliability and discipline. The massacre in Velika, brutal as it was, had not improved its standing. After Operation Draufgänger, the division tried to regroup near Peć and Prizren in Kosovo, but the situation continued to deteriorate. Partisan attacks increased, cutting off transport routes and isolating German positions. Villagers avoided interaction with the soldiers, fearing retaliation from one side or the other. Supply caravans rarely reached their destinations. Ammunition and food grew scarce. Morale fell sharply. Some soldiers looted homes to survive, which only deepened local hostility and damaged the division's reputation even further. German commanders understood that Skanderbeg could not function independently. Its failures created more problems than solutions. Reports sent to higher headquarters described the division as unfit for combat and incapable of carrying out complex operations. Even within the SS structure, where expectations were harsh, Skanderbeg stood out as a disappointing unit. This frustration eventually led to a decision in the autumn of 1944. The division would be disbanded. On the 1st of November, Heinrich Himmler officially dissolved the Skanderbeg division. Many of its ethnic Albanian soldiers had already deserted or switched sides, leaving only the German officers and ethnic German volunteers remaining. These surviving elements were absorbed into a different unit, one that already carried a dark reputation of its own: the 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prinz Eugen. This transfer strengthened the Prinz Eugen division numerically, but also brought with it the weight of Skanderbeg's failures. The Prinz Eugen division had been hardened by years of anti-partisan warfare. Its soldiers were experienced in mountain operations and knew the terrain well. But by late 1944, even this division faced overwhelming challenges. The German front in the Balkans was collapsing. Yugoslav partisans pushed south and west with growing confidence. Soviet forces advanced toward Belgrade. Communication between German commands became chaotic. Units were ordered to hold positions that could no longer be defended. Despite this chaos, new orders arrived for the Prinz Eugen division. They were to conduct rearguard actions, delay the enemies, advance, and protect the retreat of other German units withdrawing toward Croatia, Slovenia, and eventually Austria. For the soldiers, this meant constant movement through hostile territory. Roads were mined, bridges destroyed, and mountain passes filled with partisan ambushes. Every retreating step became a struggle for survival. August Schmidhuber, once the commander of the Skanderbeg division, took command of the Prinz Eugen division during this time. His leadership framed the next chapter of the war for the unit. Schmidhuber was known for strict discipline and ruthless methods. Under his command, civilians continued to suffer. Records from Split and Dubrovnik show that the division carried out arrests, executions, and retaliatory actions even while retreating. to the soldiers of Prinz Eugen. These measures were seen as necessary to maintain control during an increasingly desperate withdrawal. The division's retreat took it north through Bosnia. The landscape shifted from rugged mountains to river valleys, but danger remained constant. Each town they passed through carried memories of earlier violence. Some communities had already suffered at the hands of the division. Others feared their arrival. Hunger spread quickly as supply lines broke apart. Partisan forces, now supported by Soviet units in certain areas, pursued the retreating Germans relentlessly. They attacked bridges, railways, and mountain trails. Their once powerful division became smaller each week, weakened by losses, surrendering groups, and men who slipped away in the night. By the spring of 1945, the German retreat had turned into a race to reach Austria. Many soldiers believed that surrendering to the Western Allies would offer better treatment than falling into partisan hands. Rumors spread quickly. British and American forces were more lenient, more orderly, and less likely to carry out revenge killings. This hope, however, ignored the reality on the ground. The division still had to cross Yugoslav territory filled with people who remembered every atrocity committed by the occupying forces. Still, the Prinz Eugen division continued north. Their path carried them toward Slovenia, a region that had seen its own share of conflict. The journey was exhausting. Soldiers slept in fields, in barns, or wherever they could find shelter. Cold nights, hunger, and constant danger drained even the most experienced fighters. The arrogance and certainty they once displayed had disappeared, replaced by fear and confusion. As they neared the Slovenian town of Celje in May 1945, the division faced its last major decision. The war in Europe had ended. German forces everywhere were surrendering. Hope rose among the soldiers that they might reach British or American lines, but the roads were blocked. The territory around them controlled by Yugoslav forces, and the division had no strength left to push farther north. They had reached the end of their long retreat. By early May 1945, the last German units in the Balkans were collapsing. The Prinz Eugen division, once feared across Yugoslavia, was now a broken force. Its retreat north through Bosnia and Croatia had drained its strength. Many soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and unsure of what awaited them. All they knew was that the war was ending, and they needed to surrender somewhere safe. The idea of reaching Austria kept them moving. They believed the Western Allies would treat them more fairly than the Yugoslav partisans. But the map no longer worked in their favour. Every road they tried to take led them toward Yugoslav-controlled areas. On the 10th of May, the division reached the outskirts of Celje, a town in Slovenia. The war in Europe had officially ended 2 days earlier, and German forces across the continent were laying down their arms. For the soldiers of Prinz Eugen, surrender felt like the only option left. They were surrounded, they had no supplies, and the threats around them grew by the hour. When Yugoslav units arrived, the Germans gave up quickly. Their weapons were stacked in large piles, their columns were separated, and soldiers were marched into temporary holding areas. Many expected a formal process registration, questioning, transport to prison camps, maybe even repatriation to Germany months later. They had heard rumours that Tito wanted prisoners screened rather than immediately punished. But hope began to fade as soon as they saw the expressions of the Yugoslav soldiers watching them. These were men who had lived through years of occupation. Their towns had been burned, their families killed, and their homes taken. They remembered the villages destroyed during anti-partisan campaigns. They remembered Velika and dozens of other massacres. The days that followed the surrender were tense. The prisoners were held in fields, barns, and schoolyards. Food was scarce. Some German officers tried to reassure their men, insisting that they would be transferred north soon. But the Yugoslav commanders on the ground had their own ideas about justice, ideas shaped not by distant political orders, but by the memories of friends and families lost. Tito's official instructions were to detain the prisoners, screen them for war criminals, and hold them for future trials. Yet these instructions did not reach every commander. or were not followed by those who carried deep personal anger. On the 11th of May, several groups of prisoners were marched out of Selj. Some believed they were being transferred to a camp. Others sensed that something was wrong. When the march continued farther into the countryside, the groups were separated by rank and unit, with many members of the Prinz Eugen division kept apart from other German formations. The guards seemed tense and focused, saying little as they pushed the prisoners along rural paths. The landscape around Selji was quiet: green fields, patches of forest, and farms scattered across gentle hills. It looked peaceful, but the mood among the prisoners grew darker with every step. The following day brought the moment no one expected. One by one, groups of prisoners were taken toward forest clearings, abandoned quarries, or newly dug trenches. There were no formal announcements or written orders. Instead, the pattern became clear only as it happened. The Yugoslav soldiers stripped their captives of clothing, tied their hands with telephone wire, and forced them to kneel beside pits. For many prisoners, this was the first realization that surrender had not saved them. Some prisoners tried to plead, others froze in shock, and some simply stared ahead, too exhausted to react. Gunfire echoed through the valleys for hours as group after group was killed. Bodies fell into trenches, sometimes stacked upon one another. The process repeated itself throughout the countryside around Selja. The number of dead grew with each passing hour. By the time the killings ended, thousands of former soldiers from the Prinz Eugen division had been executed without trial. Their actions the previous summer had left hundreds of Montenegrin villagers dead. From the perspective of many Yugoslav fighters, this was not only punishment, it was the closing of a wound that had been open since 1941. The occupiers had inflicted years of terror. In these final days of the war, that terror came back upon them with equal force. In 2010, a mass grave was discovered near the Slovenian village of Brežice. Inside were the remains of nearly 2,000 soldiers from the Prinz Eugen division. They had been stripped naked, bound together, and shot before being buried in a long trench. For historians and families, the discovery confirmed what survivors and local villagers had whispered for years. The executions had been large, systematic, and carried out immediately after surrender. The tragedy of Velika and the slaughter near Selje became permanently linked. One was the crime, the other the consequence. Both events left deep scars on the region and shaped the memories of entire communities. For Germans who survived the war, the loss of the division became a symbol of the chaos and bitterness of the final days. For Yugoslav families, the executions were seen by some as justice, by others as an act of war that should have been judged in court. While thousands of soldiers from the Prinz Eugen division died in the fields and forests around Selja, their former commander, August Schmidhuber, met a different fate. He had moved north with the retreating German columns, hoping to escape the collapse in the Balkans. But the war ended before he could reach safety. On the 11th of May, just 3 days after Germany's surrender, partisan units captured him near the Austrian border. His capture was calm, almost quiet, unlike the chaos that had followed his men. But the silence did not soften the reality that waited for him. Schmidhuber was quickly transferred to Belgrade, where a Yugoslav military tribunal prepared to investigate a long list of accusations. These included responsibility for massacres, deportations, and violence against civilians across Montenegro, Kosovo, and Croatia. By the time he stood in front of the military judges, the evidence against him had already been collected, reports he had signed, orders he had issued, and testimonies from survivors who remembered the insignia of the units he commanded. The process moved steadily, guided by a determination to hold at least one high-ranking officer accountable for the suffering inflicted during the occupation. The trial ended with a sentence of death. Schmidhuber was ultimately hanged in February 1947. His execution closed one chapter of responsibility, but only one. The majority of the soldiers under his command, those who carried out the massacres in Velika and elsewhere, never stood before any court. Their punishment had come swiftly and brutally in Slovenia, leaving no records of individual guilt, no testimonies, and no opportunity for families to learn the full truth. Their stories ended in the same anonymous trenches where their bodies were buried. For the families of Velika, the years after the war were marked by grief and a difficult search for meaning. Many survivors rebuilt their homes, repaired the fields, and tried to return to daily routines. Each birthday, each holiday, each new season reminded them of the faces that were missing. Parents had lost children, children had lost parents, and entire generations grew up with stories of relatives they never met. The massacre shaped village identity in ways that never faded. In the broader context of Yugoslavia, the tragedy at Velika was one of many wartime atrocities. It existed alongside massacres in Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia acts committed by Axis forces, local collaborators, and sometimes by returning partisan groups seeking revenge. More than 1 million people in Yugoslavia lost their lives during the war, and more than half of them were civilians. The scale of the suffering made it difficult for communities to process each event individually. The story of Velika was remembered most strongly by those who lived closest to it. For others, it blended into the wider memory of war. The discovery of the Brzezic mass grave in 2010 brought new attention to the final days of the Prinz Eugen division. For the first time, archaeologists and historians could confirm details long described in local oral histories. The trench contained nearly 2,000 bodies, stripped and bound, still carrying the traces of telephone wire around their wrists. The condition of the remains left no doubt that the executions were deliberate and organized. News of the discovery spread across Europe, reopening discussions about revenge, war crimes, and justice. Some viewed the executions as a natural response to years of occupation and brutality. Others argued that even the worst offenders deserved a formal trial. Historical debates grew more complex as researchers examined documents from both sides, German reports minimizing atrocities, Yugoslav reports denying revenge killings, and survivor accounts that filled the gaps between the official records. The story of Velika and the story of Selja became symbols of how war blurs the lines between justice and retribution. In Montenegro and Serbia, memorials were built to honor the victims of Velika. Families gathered each year to read the names of the dead, many of whom were children. The ceremonies were quiet, filled more with reflection than anger. Survivors spoke about the importance of memory, of ensuring that younger generations understood what had happened and why it mattered. They wanted the world to know that the massacre was not just a historical statistic, but a human tragedy with lasting consequences. Meanwhile, in communities connected to the Prinz Eugen division, memory took a different form. Some descendants searched for information about relatives who vanished in 1945, hoping to learn more about their final days. Others struggled with the knowledge that their ancestors may have participated in atrocities. For many families, the war left behind unanswered questions that stretched across decades. The end of the war did not erase the violence. It only shifted the responsibility of remembering from the soldiers to the generations that followed. The massacre in Velika and the executions in Slovenia became linked not only by historical fact but by shared loss. One showed the danger of power used without restraint. The other showed the consequences when that power collapses. As the story closes, the weight of these events still hangs over the region. The hills and valleys of Montenegro hold memories of families destroyed, while the forests of Slovenia hold the remains of those who carried out the violence. The past lives quietly in both places, shaping how communities think about war, justice, and the long shadow of history. Velika stands today as a reminder that civilians often bear the worst of conflict, and that even when justice comes, it rarely feels complete. The war ended in 1945, but its echoes continue, carried through stories, memorials, and the determination of people who refuse to forget.